Jason saw the first moth in his kitchen. He was just pulling his TV dinner out of the oven when he noticed the insect next to the wall clock. It wasn't unusual for a few moths to sneak in the door during the summer, but most of the ones he'd seen were small and brown. This one was larger, like the wingspan would cover his hand completely if he held it in his palm. The body also had a sort of red tint to it, and Jason could swear it was more a faint glow than a color. What kind of moth looked like that? Maybe one of those invasive species from another country. Either way, it wasn't hanging around his house. Jason reached into a cabinet near the sink and pulled out a swatter. He eyed the creature, making sure it wouldn't fly before he took a swipe. The moth remained still, wings twitching ever so slightly up and down. Jason held back until he was sure the time was right, then whap! The plastic end collided with the bug, and it fell to the floor without another motion. Not wanting to touch the thing, Jason scooped the body up with a dustpan and dropped it into the garbage can before returning to his dinner. He soon forgot about the incident. 2 more showed up the same week, this time in his bedroom. Jason disposed of them in similar fashion as the first, still unsure of where they were coming from, or even if they were moths in the first place. It was a few days later when he exited the shower to find 4 of them crawling on his toilet that Jason decided to take action. His neighbor Anna from a few doors up had experience in extermination, so before calling anyone, he paid her a visit. She frowned as Jason described the size and strange color. "That doesn't sound like any moth I've ever seen," she said. "Did you keep any of the, bodies?" "No, they went out with this week's trash. Freaked me out too much to keep," Jason replied. "I'm sure we could find more if we looked." Anna followed Jason back to his house, and the two scoured the walls for any sign. After a few minutes, Jason spied one on the door leading to the basement. It donned the same long wings and crimson tint as the others. He pointed the strange insect out to Anna just as another landed next to it. Anna's eyes widened. "My God, they're huge!" she gaped, taking a closer look while keeping her distance. "You think they're invasive? Like one of those bugs that get here on cargo ships?" Jason asked. "Could be. North America doesn't have any species that looks like this. If there are this many showing up out in the open, you might have an infestation." "I was afraid of that." Anna jotted something on a piece of paper. "Here, this is the number of a pest expert I used to work with named Dan. If anybody can take care of your bug problem, he can." Jason made the call later that night, getting squeezed in for an appointment the next day. Soon after, he lay in bed, unable to stop his mind from running wild. He'd never dealt with an infestation before. Something about the word infested sent a chill down his spine. How many moths were crawling all over the house at that very moment? Jason looked towards the shadows around his dresser and closet. There he could see a slight flutter of wings and a faint red glow. One had followed him into the room, or at least he hoped it was only one. He began to sweat, and the night became a restless blur of tossing and turning. Dan showed up in a white van around lunchtime. He was a gray-haired, thin man wearing overalls and large glasses. Jason explained the problem to him, and Dan rubbed his chin. "Were you able to find a point they might be coming from?" he asked. "It seems like they hover around the basement door a lot," Jason told him as he led Dan through the kitchen. Sure enough, a moth sat on the ceiling right above the door to the cellar. "Ah, I see," Dan said, staring at the strange insect. "Can't say I know what kind that is, and I've dealt with every bug this side of the country." "Do you think you can get rid of them?" "I can certainly try. The first thing I'm going to do is poke around your basement a bit, see if I can't pinpoint a nesting area. I'll let you know if I find something." Jason tried to continue with his day without much success. He couldn't help but focus on the bumps and knocks coming from below the floorboards. About 20 minutes later, Dan called him down. "Found the source," he announced once Jason descended the steps. He was standing in front of an old cabinet Jason had inherited from his grandmother. It hadn't been moved for years, until Dan seemingly shoved it aside. Behind it was a cracked hole in the bricks, like someone had stuck a hammer through the wall. A moth crawled out of the opening and several more dim lights were moving around inside the dark break. "Oh shit!" Jason gasped. "How'd they even get in there?" "Bugs are crafty little suckers. They'll find any nook or cranny to hide in humans wouldn't even notice," Dan explained. "Anyway, what I'm going to do now is get some spray from my van and hopefully exterminate the nest." Dan went out to his van and returned a few minutes later with a gas mask and a large can of spray connected to a hose. "You're going to want to stay up here while I do this, and let the fumes clear out once I'm done. It won't be long," he said. Jason agreed and let him get to work. Everything seemed fine for the first few minutes. Then Jason heard Dan scream. The sound of him clambering up the steps followed, and seconds later he burst through the door, fingers clutching at his gas mask. "What happened?" Jason yelled, trying to help the thrashing man to a chair. Dan ripped the gas mask off and threw it to the floor with a clatter. Two of the moth creatures flew out, scattering to other parts of the room. "They got inside the mask," he continued to scream. "Those wings, they're like knives. Oh God, it stings." Jason saw cuts on Dan's cheeks. They were small, but drops of blood were beginning to trickle from them. Before his eyes, the skin began to redden and swell. Dan stumbled through the kitchen, falling to his knees and shaking as he held his damaged face. Jason, not knowing what else to do, called an ambulance. They came within 10 minutes and loaded a still groaning Dan into the back. The swelling had risen, and it looked as if an entire orange was jutting from his right cheek as they rushed him away. Jason watched the flashing lights disappear around the bend. What the hell was he dealing with? What kind of insect could lacerate someone's face that severely? Jason's mind raced as he walked back towards his house. As he shut the door, a moth on the window pane greeted him mere inches from his face. He froze and stared at the faint glow while the vicious wings twitched. Was it staring back at him? He kept the basement door shut tight after that. The swatter stayed near him for the rest of the day, and every time he saw one of the things, he took it out. He found himself shaking more with each sighting, and Jason knew he was no longer unnerved. He was scared. Night fell. Jason was sitting on the couch when it occurred to him that Dan didn't have the spray canister when he'd run back up the steps. If he was going to get any sleep, having some kind of defense would certainly help. That, however, would mean going back down to where the apparent nest was. Would it be worth risking similar wounds as Dan? The horrible image of his reddened, swollen face returned. As he pondered this option, Jason jumped at a slight buzzing in the air. One of the insects had flown right above him and was hovering around the light. That settled it. The risk was worth it. Jason stood with his hand on the doorknob, hesitating once again before making the descent. He took a breath. The door let out a creak as he eased it open and peered into the darkness. He half expected to hear angry buzzing and be struck by the swarm that had attacked Dan, but there was only silence. Jason flicked the light switch. The dim yellow bulb revealed Dan's canister and hose on the ground right next to the dresser. Where were the moths? Jason took a few steps down the staircase, keeping his eyes on the air in case one of the things flew at him. Once at the bottom, he crept towards the cabinet. The hole in the wall sat there, like the mouth of an ominous cave. None of the insects seemed to be around it, either. Jason reached down and picked up the metal canister, feeling almost paranoid with their absence. He was about to hurry back up the steps with his new weapon in hand when he caught sight of something inside the torn part of the wall. It was a light. This one was different from the moth's glow. It was an eerie shade of orange and much brighter. Jason couldn't see far enough inside the crack to know where it was coming from. He leaned in a little closer. In his mind, the light almost seemed to be drawing him towards it. A sudden creak from behind him made Jason whirl around. The old cabinet sat still, but the door was suddenly easing open. He looked inside and saw nothing, until the door opened further. Clinging to the inside wood were at least 15 of the moths, crawling in circles around the aged pine. Jason gasped. It was the most he'd seen in one place. He gripped the hose in his shaking hand and aimed at the pile, not sure if he should spray or not. What if they swarmed him and he ended up worse than Dan? He didn't get to decide. Out of nowhere, one of the moths from the pile took flight towards him, startling Jason into pulling the trigger. A green mist sprayed out and coated the dresser. Every insect on the door flew into the air, and Jason kept spraying in a frenzy as the room filled with agitated buzzing. In confusion and panic, Jason tripped over the metal can and tumbled backwards, crashing straight through the crumbled wall where the hole was. Jason landed on his back. He threw his hands up to shield his face from the evil wings, turning over and bracing for an attack. As he did, his hand touched something on the ground. There where he landed was a perfect circle of orange light burned into the concrete floor. It stretched about 10 feet wide. Jason felt a pulse of energy as he touched it, like laying a hand on an old television screen. When he looked up, he found the entire world around him had changed. What his eyes beheld nearly drove him insane. He knew he was somewhere else, somewhere far, far away from his basement. He could feel it. He'd stumbled into a nightmare. Thousands of moths, squirming and fluttering over each other, covered every inch of every conceivable direction. They were above, below, everywhere possible. The air itself twisted with crawling insect legs and hummed with deafening flutters. Jason screamed, the image of Dan's swollen red face flashing over and over. His body tensed beyond control at the anticipation of being covered in the terrible insects. Yet they didn't come. Jason looked down and found the orange circle still glowing, and none of the moths passing the perimeter. Was it shielding him somehow? In his overwhelmed mind, an odd feeling of safety came. It didn't last. Jason saw something else amidst the mass of insects. A shape moved towards him like a wave in the ocean, at a speed that made his heart quake. Just when Jason thought it would run over him, it stopped at the circle's edge, like the piles of moths did. The shape fluctuated, still completely covered by insects, as it seemed to be pushing itself against an invisible wall. Jason realized that this was a living creature. He didn't know if he wanted to see what it looked like. When the unseen thing started to ram against the circle, Jason began to scream again. The sound seemed to enrage it, and the shape slammed harder, a blood-curdling roar emanating from some hidden orifice. Jason clutched his legs and slid as far back in the circle as he could, terror finally driving panic into his mind, when all of a sudden he felt himself fall backwards. He landed with a bump onto concrete. When he looked up, he found himself back in his basement. The hole in the wall he'd tumbled through earlier lay in rubble. Meanwhile, the orange circle had been completely exposed to open cellar. 2 more moths appeared out of thin air from inside its borders, confirming exactly where all of them had come from. Jason stared at the glowing sphere burned into the floor. He noticed something he hadn't before. The size was pulsing, as if something was pushing against it from the other side. His mind began to spiral. He was going crazy. Whatever he had just seen couldn't possibly be real. He steadied himself against the cabinet and began to breathe as deep as his lungs allowed. While his hand grasped the wood, he didn't notice one of the insects crawling towards his fingers. Jason felt a sudden tickle on his right pinky and ripped it away just as a tiny set of legs grazed skin. The moth left ground mere centimeters from Jason's face, and as more fluttered into the air from unknown places, he lost control and booked it up the stairs. The spray can he'd come for was left on the ground. Hey there, this is Matt Aldrich, and thanks for listening to the story. Or at least, the first part of the story. Keep an eye out for part 2 in the coming weeks. In the meantime, if you enjoyed this story, check out my others, and subscribe to get notified when new ones go up. For more updates and other cool stuff, give me a follow on Twitter. You can find that link in the description. Stay tuned for part 2, and until then, keep an eye on those insects crawling inside your walls. Bye now.